You've probably seen block-based editors like this in apps like Notion. Today, we're going to build one in Next.js using the BlockNotes library with custom image uploads powered by UploadThing. In addition to the normal styled content that you can see here, it will also have support for inline images that we can upload and also for a cover image here at the very top. If you want to follow along, the starter code is linked in the description. With that, let's jump in. I have the starter code pulled up, which is just a new Next.js project. Let's get started by building out the headline at the top. To help, we're going to use React text area auto size. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the page file. And inside this main tag, I'm going to set up a container div, make a div, go ahead and add some class names here. Flex call, a horizontal padding 24, vertical padding of 10, and width of full. Then inside this div, we're going to add that component from the library. So I'm just going to go to the top here of home and I'm going to import it. So import text area auto size from React text area auto size. And then inside this div, I'm just going to add this component. Now you'll see there's an error here because this component uses useRef under the hood, which you can only do in the client component. So let's go ahead and make this use client at the top. So now it's loaded in and we have the area here. Doesn't look very good. So let's style it. So we're going to add width of full, resize none, appearance none, overflow hidden, BG of transparent, text 5XL, font bold, and for focus, we want the outline to be none. So now when I click here, this looks much better. I will also add a placeholder attribute here, and I'm just going to say untitled. So now there's this nice placeholder, and I'm just going to get rid of this placeholder heading. Now let's move on to adding the actual block editor below this headline. We're going to use another library called BlockNote, which is an open source block editor. We're going to throw all this into a separate component. So I'm going to create a new file here in a components folder, call it editor.tsx. And let me just go ahead and add it here so we can see it. So editor. Okay, so that's brought in. Right off the bat, the first thing I'm going to do is make this a client component because we're going to do a lot of interactivity stuff inside of here. Let's first set up the props that this component is going to take. So we'll create an interface for editor props, and there's going to be three things that this component takes. So first is going to be an onChange function. So this will be what gets called when the content of the editor changes. Second will be a property we'll call initial content, which will be if we want to load anything in when this editor starts. And finally will be a attribute called editable, which is, as the name implies, if we want this editor to be read-only or not. Okay, let's go ahead and just bring these props into the component. So this is a functional component, which uses these props. And I'll destructure these props in the constructor. So now let's go ahead and set up the BlockNote library in this component. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a object called editor. And this will be of type BlockNote editor, which comes from the BlockNote library. And we're going to use a hook from the library called useCreateBlockNote. And this will accept a bunch of different configuration parameters that we'll pass in. So first will be initial content. And what I'll say here is if we have some initial content, which we may not, then I will parse it. So JSON.parse of initial content. And I'll cast this to be a partial block array, which again, this is a type from the BlockNote library. Else, this will just be undefined and we'll have a empty editor to start with. So for now, that will be the only configuration we pass in. So now let's go ahead and add the JSX here. So I'm going to return a BlockNote view from, again, the BlockNote library. And this is going to take a few properties. So first will be editor, which will just be the editor object that we just created. Take editable, which we set up as a prop. Pass a theme, which for now I'll just set to light. And finally will be an onChange function, which again, we'll just pass through from our props. Now let's hit save. And we already am starting to see some stuff here on the right. So it says enter text or type a command. This is looking a bit ugly. As you can see here, I can do slash and this seems completely messed up visually. And that's because we need to import some CSS. So here at the top, I'm going to get rid of this React import. We need to import first from BlockNote at BlockNote core and then fonts inter.css. And then I also want to import from BlockNote/React the style.css file. So now immediately you can see there's some different styling here. And if I can start to type stuff here, for example, okay, this is starting to look much more like we would expect here. So I can do a heading, I can do a bullet list. You'll notice right now this is a bit offset. So just to fix this, I'm gonna wrap this in a div and just add some padding to this div. So on this div, I'm just gonna add a negative margin X of 54 pixels and margin Y of 4. So now this brings us in line with the headline. This is my note. Reasons why you should subscribe to Built with Code. 90% of you watching are not subscribed. If you're finding value from the content, your support is appreciated and it's free. So this is clearly working as expected. But now if we go back, there's an error because we need to pass on change in. I'm not going to really do anything here. I'm just going to pass in an empty function. But this theoretically would be where if you were saving this to a database, this is what you would pass in, would be maybe a database call. Now, one small thing that isn't apparent right now is we're actually not importing this editor component correctly as it is. So I have just a BlockNote documentation pulled up on the right-hand side here. If I zoom in and scroll down, one thing it says is you should import BlockNote using dynamic imports with Next to make sure it's only imported on the client side. So let's just go ahead and quickly do that. Here at the top, I'm first going to import dynamic from Next Dynamic, which is the built-in Next.js package for doing dynamic imports. And I also am going to need to pull in use memo from React. So now inside of this component, I'm going to do the import. So const editor equals use memo. And in this, it's going to take a function and it's just going to do dynamic and import the same path for the import. So @/components/editor. And we are going to also just pass in this SSR is false attribute as well. And then finally, there's no dependencies. So we pass an empty array here. So now all I got to do is remove this import at the top. If I hit save, all right, and this still seems to be working. One of the cool features that comes with BlockNote here is the ability to support inline image uploads. Now, by default, there is an image option here in the editor. The one thing that we need to do is we need to provide a backend though to support this file uploading. And for this, we're going to use UploadThing as our backend for file uploads. If you haven't heard of UploadThing, it's a way to really easily add file uploading to your application. All right, so I have the documentation for UploadThing up here for the Next.js app router, and we're just going to go through the steps here to set up UploadThing in our project. Now, the first thing you should do before any of this is you should make sure you have an account. It's free to get started. It's very generous for personal projects. After you do that, come here, and now let's go through this. So first thing, install packages. I've already done that in the starter code for you. Next, let's set up the environment variables that we'll use to talk to the UploadThing backend. So for this, I'm just going to go ahead and create a .env.local file. And what you want to do is add these two environment variables. So the UploadThing secret and the UploadThing app ID. You'll be able to find these pretty easily when you go into your dashboard in your UploadThing account. So you just take those and copy them here. I'm not going to add them here on screen because that's a security risk. Now, with that set up, let's go to setting up the file router here on the right. So it looks like we need to create a API route for UploadThing. So let's go here and inside of the app, let's create a new folder for API. And this will be an UploadThing folder. And then inside here, make a core.ts file, yoink this, paste it here. Looks like we gotta make another route in here. So this will be actually what gets hit when we hit the endpoint. Route.ts, yoink this, paste it. For now, I'm going to, I will go ahead and set up the Tailwind config here because we are going to use it in a little bit. So let's go ahead to the Tailwind config file. We need to import this and then we just wrap the config looks like. So we just say with ut this config. All right, and just like that, we have file uploading mostly set up. Now, the final thing I want to do is pull some utility functions that UploadThing can generate for us to connect up to our components here on the front end. So for this, I'm going to create a new folder. We'll call this utils. And inside this, we'll make a uploadthing.ts file. And let me just move this outside the app directory into the source. And inside here, I'm just going to copy in some helpers that I also pulled from the documentation, admittedly. So the main things here to call out. So here on line 6, we are exporting this function called upload files, which is from this generate react helpers function that comes with UploadThing, and we're passing in the file router that we just set up in our API routes here. And then we're also doing a generate upload button using our file router. But the most important thing is this function here for upload files, which we can just call anywhere to start the upload process. So now let's go back to the editor, and inside of this BlockNote editor object that we created here, as another parameter, we can pass in a upload file function, which will handle the file uploads for example, these inline images. So here, this will be a async, takes a file object, and here I'll say const res is await upload files, which is from the utils we just generated. We'll use the image uploader. This is something that we set up in the API routes earlier from the code we copied in. And then here we just have to pass in what the files are. And in this case, it's just a single file. And now I just need to make sure to return the URL of the file that we just uploaded. So now let's try uploading an image. So here I'm going to add an image block. Go hit upload image. And there we go. Now, as a final part to this editor, let's go ahead and just add also a cover image at the very top. You might have seen this if you used an app like Notion. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new component for this. We'll call this cover, create a new functional component. Let's set up the props we're going to need here. So interface, cover props. And for right now, let's just pass in a URL. And this will be optional, type string. Let's make this component use these props. And now let's set up the structure of this component. So inside this return, first we'll make this a div. And this div, we're going to say this is position relative with the full height of, let's say 35 view height. And we'll give it a background of neutral 300. So let's save. And let me just go into this page and go ahead and just add the cover here so we can start seeing it. Okay, so there we go. There's the cover and there's that gray that we set up. So now going back here inside this div, what we want is a image that takes up the entirety of this container. So for this, we're going to use next image. So let me pull in a next image component, and this image will require a few things. So first will be source, which will be the URL. Next will be the alt text, which is called this cover. We'll have this fill. We'll give it a class name of object cover to scale appropriately, and also pass in the sizes property so that we tell Next, hey, this image is not going to be bigger than 100 view width. So no need to send out a bigger image. So this is throwing an error because it doesn't like that this URL is optional. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to surround all of this in a block that says, if we have a URL, then let's go ahead and display out this image. Okay, so that's the basic setup here. Let's go ahead and pass in an image to see if this actually works. So back here in the home, let's just start by passing an URL. And here I've just grabbed a URL from Unsplash, which will give us back a random image in landscape. I hit save, and we get an error because next image security, which has good intent, but can sometimes be quite annoying. So for this, we gotta go into the next config file. All right, so I just pasted in these configs, images, remote patterns that we'll accept. These couple are from Unsplash, as you can see here. And this first one is an UploadThing. So this will allow us to use UploadThing files as well. The reason why the inline version worked is because that wasn't using next image under the hood. but we'll see that we're going to use file uploading for these cover images as well. Okay, with that sorted, let's go ahead and refresh this. And there you go. We have an image showing up. I want to add one other small thing here, which by default, when we open this, we shouldn't have a cover, and we should have a button here that allows us to add a cover, and then this shows up. So first thing I'm going to do for that is I'm going to set up state to store what the cover image URL is at the moment. So cover URL, set cover URL is useState. And by default, I'm just going to, for now, copy this in, and let's import useState. And here in the URL, as you can imagine, I will now just pass in the state. To make this disappear, if we don't have a URL object, let's go back into the cover component and let's add some logic to this surrounding div here. So let's convert this to be a string literal and surround this as well in curly braces. And then now inside here, I will say, if we don't have a URL, then let's also add hidden, else we won't add anything. So let's test it. So if I go here and if I go ahead and remove this default value of the state and hit save, okay, this component has now visually at least disappeared. To make this reappear, let's add a button to add the cover back in. Down here inside this div, I'm going to first make another div, and I'm going to move this text area auto size into this div. And on this div, I'm going to add some classes. So group, flex call, and gap of 2. And then above the text area, I'm going to add a logical render. So I'm going to say, if we don't have a cover URL, then let's render out some stuff, and specifically a button. So I'm going to do a div, and this div will have opacity of 0, group hover, opacity 100, transition opacity, and then let's add a button. And this button will just say add cover. And let me just go ahead and add this nice emoji here of a camera as well. And on this button, we'll say hover, the BG will be neutral 100, text will be neutral 400, rounded of medium, and a horizontal padding of 3. Let's refresh. And now when I hover over the headline, I see this add cover button, and that's what this group is doing here. So I group together the button and the header so that this group hover gets triggered. Let me also go ahead and just add some vertical padding to this to make it look a little bit better, and also transition colors. So now when I hover, okay, this button looks better. Okay, but right now if we click this button, it does nothing. So let's fix that. So inside this button, we also want an on click. And it's just going to call enable cover, which is a function that we'll create here. So up here, we'll say enable cover is a function. And for now, I'll just say set cover URL, and I'll set it to that random unsplash image. So now refresh, click the button, the cover shows, it loads an image. Now, the one thing you'll notice is I said this is supposed to be a random image, but it's the same image that we saw earlier. And this is because of caching. The next image is trying to be smart here because it's the same exact URL. It's caching the image. So you could disable the cache here, but in reality, the caching is meant to be there for a good reason. So instead, I'm going to go here in the function, and I'm going to fetch this URL instead. And on fetching, it will then give me the redirected URL to the random image. So inside of here, I would just say set cover URL to be random image.url. And because we're awaiting, we need to make this async. So now if I hit save, if I refresh the page, add a cover, now it's a completely different image now of looks like a galaxy somewhere. All right, so the final thing that we are going to add to this image cover is the ability to upload our own files using the same UploadThing infrastructure we set up earlier. And in this case, what's really nice is that UploadThing comes with some components, specifically an upload button component, which is automatically connected to the backend that we generated. In the cover component, let's add this button. So we're still going to want to check to make sure we have a URL, but because we need to add a second component in the return, let's surround this in a fragment. And then next to this image, we're going to add a div, and this div is going to have a class name, position absolute, width of 20%, height of 20%, right 0, bottom 0, group, flex, justify, center, and item center. And just to see what we're doing, let me add a BG yellow 400. And you can see what I've done here essentially is just added a target box essentially in the bottom right for this button to be in. Now, inside this div, we're going to use the upload button that we got from UploadThing. So let's pull an upload button from, in this case, the utils file that we created. And this button is going to take a few different properties. So the first one is going to be endpoint. Now, this is going to be image uploader. And now if I hit save, you can already see we have a button here on the right. Now this is how the default button looks, but we can style this to look however we want. So I'm going to give some class names, width of fit. And to access some of these individual components of the button, we can use some custom Tailwind selectors that UploadThing built in. So for example, we have UT allowed content. So this is referring to if you want to style this image 4 megabyte text here, what we want to do is not even show it. So we're just going to apply hidden on that. That goes away. Now, if you want to style the button itself, we will use the UT button selector, background of neutral 200. And let me also just give it a hover of BG neutral 300. I'll give it a text neutral of 800. And on this button, I'll also give it a transition colors. Okay, so now we've updated the background. And if I hover, it has this change in the background color. Let me get rid of this yellow background. Okay, so now we have a decently looking button. By default, I want this to be hidden, and only when I hover near it, make it visible. On the button, let's also add, by default, opacity will be 0. But when we have a group hover, let's make the opacity 100, and let's set the transition of the opacity. So now if I hover, there we go. Now I could have here just set hover opacity 100, and when I hover, it still shows up. But you'll notice in order to see this button, my cursor needs to be right over where the button is going to be. When this is hidden, I have no idea this button may even be there. So how do I know I should hover there? But by making this a group hover and attaching the hover action to the parent, which if you remember, if I just go ahead and enable the background again, I kind of purposefully made the target area of this hover much bigger than the button itself. So now when I hover over any part of this yellow square, this button shows up. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this. So if I hit choose file, I'll select this image. Okay, it's running, it comes back, but nothing happens. And that's because we now need to take this image we uploaded and update the URL on the cover. So the button luckily has a callback built in that we can use. So we'll set on client upload complete. It takes the response, and I can say set URL to res0.url. Now we'll see that we actually don't have the set URL available to us in cover props. So what we need to do is we need to pass it down from the page component where we have the state being stored. So in the cover props, I'm just going to add set URL as a property we'll need, which will be a function. And now if I go back to the page, let's go ahead and just pass it in. So set URL will be set cover URL. And let's also just add this as the props destructuring. Okay, and now we have this function. So now let's try this again. Choose file, this file, it uploads, and it now updates the cover image. With that, we finished creating this block editor. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. And on screen now is another video for you to check out, and I'll see you in the next video.